Good morning, sixth grade. This lesson is for Thursday, March 19th. And we're going to continue on with our lesson of the carbon cycle. So we were talking about carbon yesterday, and we were saying that carbon is really important for life to continue to exist, right? And we said that carbon is so essential because it makes up all of our nutrients, right? So carbohydrates, proteins, fats, it is the building blocks of our cells, right? All of our cells that basically allow for our bodies to exist. That is made up of mostly carbon, our DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, and that's the code that tells our cells how to function and how to look, what it's supposed to do. Okay, so that is also essentially made up of carbon and pretty much all existence, right? And this goes from humans to plants to animals to insects to bacteria. Everything that exists has these carbon compounds, okay? And we know that carbon is essential, carbon is important because we know it has 6 protons, right? And if it has 6 protons, it has 6 electrons. And so we drew out what a carbon would look like. And so 6p plus, we have our first shell has 2 and our second shell has 4. By the way, notice how I'm drawing the electrons, showing that they are far away from each other, right? The electrons are going to want to stay as far away from each other as possible, right? Because they repel, right? These subatomic particles, the protons repel each other, electrons repel each other, but the protons and electrons are attracted to each other. And this is something that you should be familiar with. It's something that we learned in the past, okay? So we have this carbon compound and this carbon element, right? And it's going to form these long chains, okay? And next year we're really going to delve deeply into it. But I'm just going to give you an example of something that is made out of carbon that is essential for life, that you all eat it, your cells are made up of it, and that's protein, okay? So proteins are made up of carbon, and I'm going to shorthand draw it. I'm not going to draw it as a Bohr's model. I'm going to shorthand draw it. But basically we have a carbon connected to another carbon. This carbon is connected to an oxygen, which is also double bonded to another oxygen. It's connected to a hydrogen. And then down here, we call it R. The element itself is not R. The element, it's called an R group because this itself can form various different chains. And depending on the type of protein it is, this is where you have variation. And that's connected to a nitrogen, which is connected to a hydrogen and another hydrogen, okay? So this over here, if you see, so this is like kind of the backbone, this is the base. And then here, when it goes to the R group, this is where it starts to get into the bigger chains, okay? But this is, by the way, you don't memorize this, you don't need to know this. I'm just kind of showing you an example of where these carbon, right? This is a protein, but look, we have this carbon backbone. And by the way, this could be a carbon connected to another carbon, connected to an oxygen, connected to another carbon, right? And these are going to form its own chains. And then you end up with these very long, complex compounds, okay? These long chains and these long compounds, okay? So this is just an example. Don't worry. I know it looks scary. You will have to know this in 7th grade. So I'm kind of giving you a preview of what's to come. But right now in 6th grade, you don't need to know it. It's just kind of just to show you when you have a protein like this, right, what it can end up forming and why it creates these very large compounds and very essential to our life here on Earth, okay? So now that we have a slight understanding of it, just to kind of go just a step further, just to understand that carbon compounds which is anything made up with carbon, right, are called organic compounds. So any compound that has carbon in it is called an organic compound. Don't get confused with organic food, okay? When you go to the store and it says, oh, it's organic, what it means is it's, yes, the food itself, it all has carbon. almost all food you eat has carbon in it, whether it's organic food or inorganic food. But when the store labels it organic, it just means that it's not sprayed with pesticides, okay? I don't know why they chose the term organic. It doesn't mean that it's made up of carbon. I mean, all food you eat is made up of carbon, right? Because we said carbohydrates, which are sugars and proteins and fats, all those things are made up of carbon. So it doesn't matter whether or not they're sprayed with pesticides, they still have carbon molecule compounds and the element, obviously element carbon in it. But if it has in science, scientifically, when we talk about carbon compounds, we're talking about organic compounds, okay? And that's why, by the way, living things are called organic things, organic compounds, right? And because we are living, there are lots of non-living things that are also made up of carbon that are also called organic compounds, but we are considered organic as living because we all are made up of carbon. Okay, so let's go and talk about what happens in the carbon cycle. Why is it important, okay? I'm gonna leave the Bohr's model of carbon up here so that you can just kind of visualize it. All right, there is limited supply of carbon on Earth. Now you think, what? That makes no sense. I mean, like, isn't all pollution carbon, right? Are we constantly using carbon in our atmosphere in a form of carbon dioxide, right? So you would think, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, the reason why we have so much of it is because of this carbon cycle, right? Because we know that it cycles about, and we're going to talk about exactly how that happens, okay? So we know that there is a limited supply of carbon on Earth, but carbon seems to never run out, right? We have plenty of carbon. It seems that we're not running out of it. And that's because it's constantly being cycled, right? And that's because carbon is constantly being cycled, right? Really, really, really important stuff over here. Okay, so write this down, okay? So there's a limited supply of carbon on Earth, but carbon seems to never run out, and that's because carbon's constantly being cycled, okay? So there's going to be this constant shift in the form that carbon takes on Earth, and so that's how we're going to be constantly, that's how we're going to constantly have availability of carbon, okay? So, hopefully you're all finished writing. If not, you can always just rewind the video. Okay, so let's talk about the carbon cycle. And this I'd like you to write down as one of your index card words because on your assignments, tests, quizzes, I'm going to give you the list of index card words, and this is going to be one of them right from the beginning of the year. So this is going to be one of those words that you're going to be familiar with, and it's going to be on every quiz from here on out, okay? So the word is carbon cycle. Well, the words, okay, is the carbon cycle. And the definition is carbon's movement through the ecosystem as a solid, a liquid, or gas. So the carbon cycle, hopefully you guys can see this. Oh, I think this marker might be a little light. I'll bring the camera a little bit closer so you guys can write this down. So the carbon cycle is carbon's movement through the ecosystem as a solid, a liquid, or a gas. Okay, There you go. Okay. All right, so how does carbon move through the ecosystem? Okay. Oh, we're still crooked. Let's just straighten out there. Okay, I'm not gonna be moving this camera too often. All right, so how does carbon cycle through the ecosystem? Okay, so that's gonna be our question right now. How does carbon cycle through our ecosystem? And what did we say? What is the ecosystem? Okay, I'm not telling the answer. You should know it, okay? We learned this yesterday. So, how does carbon cycle through our ecosystem? That is what we're going to talk about right now. Now, this topic might be a little bit confusing. If you have questions, write them down as we're going. So this way, when we Zoom later on, you can ask me those questions. It's a little bit of a difficult topic. Hopefully, I'm going to try to explain things slowly. We're going to review it. And hopefully you'll be okay with this topic, okay? So how does carbon cycle through the ecosystem? So let's start with, we'll start with photosynthesis. Photosynthesis. Now I remember that in class, we did talk about this very briefly when we were talking about photon waves. And some of you said you weren't familiar with it. So I'm gonna go back now and I'm going to review what photosynthesis is and why it's important, okay? So before we talk about photosynthesis, let's talk about who does photosynthesis and why, okay? What is the process, how does it happen, and why does it happen, okay? So the organism, which is the living thing, that does photosynthesis are plants. So plants do photosynthesis. Why do plants do photosynthesis? The reason why they do photosynthesis, what is the purpose to them doing it? Okay? The purpose for plants to do this process is to make food. Plants make food through the process of photosynthesis. Okay, that is its purpose. And I want you to kind of just step back and think about for a second why a plant would need to do this process. We don't do photosynthesis. We don't do this process. Think about how we as living things, as humans, how we get our food, right? So think about yourself right now. You're in your house, right? You're watching your video. You might be sitting on your couch. You might be sitting at a desk, right? What? Your mom just came home with a cake, and your cake is sitting in your kitchen, and you are sitting on your couch, okay? What do? You want that cake. What do? Well, if you think about it, you get up, you walk to the kitchen, you get that cake. As long as your mom lets you eat the cake now, you can get that cake. You walk over there and you get it, right? How did your mom get the cake? She likely picked it up from a bakery or a store, whatever, the store. Or if she decided to make the cake on her own, right? How did she make the cake? Well, she had all sorts of ingredients. She had flour and oil and sugar and eggs. Well, how did she get it? She went to the store and she bought the stuff from the store. Well, how did the store get it? Well, they had a truck deliver it from a farm. Well, how did the farm get it, right? They grew the wheat, right? They grew the sugar. They raised the chickens. The chickens ate the grain that grew from the ground, right? And when the chickens had enough nutrients to sustain more life, it made eggs, right? So all the different processes, right, began with the farms that essentially all living things was able to get their food because the plants grew. And when the plants grew, they made food, right? Now, that cake essentially came from the plants that made it from the ground, right? And we were able to walk to the store, or we were able to walk to the kitchen, or we were able to drive from the farm with all that material, right, to make cake. Plants, however, don't have that ability. They can't walk to the store. They can't go to the kitchen to get something to eat. In order for plants to have food, they need to make it. That's the only way a plant can essentially have any sort of food. So the purpose for plants to do this process, right? Why do they do photosynthesis? What is photosynthesis? What is the process? The process is a chemical reaction. We're going to talk about that a little later on, what the chemical reaction is. But what is the purpose? The purpose of this process is for plants to make food so that they can have food to eat. Okay, we don't do this process because we can walk and get our food. Essentially, we do end up getting all of our food mainly from plants, right? We do have animal products too, and those animals, where do they get their food? Essentially from plants as well. So all food really does initially start from plants, right? It's the plants making their own food, doing photosynthesis that allows for us to have the food as well, okay? So the purpose is for photosynthesis, the purpose is to get food. So how does photosynthesis work, okay? So how do plants, let me use another marker. We might be actually running a little bit out of time, but I do want to kind of finish this. So I'm going to finish this. What do plants need to make food? There's 3 things that a plant needs. The plant needs 1, sunlight, 2, water, and 3, something called carbon dioxide. Now, some of you may have learned this in the past. Some of you may have not, okay? This is essentially the 3 ingredients that they need. Now, if you've learned it in the past, you've learned maybe a simplified version. We're going to learn it in a lot more complex way. We're going to talk about the chemical reaction. We're going to talk about the chemistry of it, right? How these compounds form and how they change, okay? So that we're going to be talking about hopefully more in our video tomorrow. So for now, have an awesome day and see you later.